Imagine a world where your heritage is treated as a permanent casting limitation, a glass ceiling made of celluloid and stubborn prejudice. For decades, a quiet but poisonous narrative circulated in the backrooms of major Hollywood studios, whispered by a legendary but narrow-minded director who claimed that Filipino actors lacked the emotional range and cultural legibility to carry a global blockbuster. He dismissed an entire nation's talent as merely background noise, relegated to roles of the silent help or the comedic sidekick. But tonight, that narrative didn't just crumble, it was detonated. As the golden statuette catches a light in the hands of a man who was once told to stick to theater in Manila, the world is forced to reckon with a talent that refused to be silenced. This is the story of Mateo Santos, the man who turned a director's insult into the fuel for the greatest cinematic performance of the decade, proving once and for all that soul has no nationality. The neon lights of Hollywood Boulevard have a way of making dreams feel reachable. Yet for Mateo Santos, they felt like distant stars viewed from the bottom of a well. Growing up in the bustling streets of Quezon City, Mateo was a prodigy of the stage, a young man who could channel the grief of 1,000 widows and the joy of 1,000 festivals with a single look. He arrived in Los Angeles with a suitcase full of hope and a reel of performances that had moved his countrymen to tears. However, he quickly learned that in the eyes of the industry's elite, he wasn't a leading man. He was a demographic. The initial months were a grueling cycle of no's and not quite what we're looking for, as he navigated a system that seemed to have a very specific, very narrow box for what a Filipino actor could be. He wasn't looking for a handout, just a chance to show that his craft was universal. But the gatekeepers were already closing the doors before he could even speak his first line. The turning point came during a high-stakes audition for The Great Horizon, a sprawling historical epic directed by Julian Vane, a man whose 3 Oscars gave him the status of a deity. Vane was known for his vision, but he was also notorious for a leaked memo in which he stated that actors from Southeast Asia, particularly Filipinos, lacked the gravitas and internal complexity required for Western protagonist roles. Mateo sat in the cold waiting room, clutching his script, unaware that the man behind the door had already decided he was a lost cause. When he finally stepped into the room, the air was thick with Vane's boredom. The director didn't even look up from his kale salad as Mateo began the monologue, a searing piece about a father losing his son to the sea. Despite the dismissal in the room, Mateo poured his entire soul into performance, his voice trembling with raw, guttural pain that should have stopped time itself. When Mateo finished, there was a deafening silence. He stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes still shimmering with the tears of the character. Julian Vane finally looked up, but not with admiration. His expression was one of mild annoyance, as if he had just watched a parlor trick. "The technique is fine, kid," Vane said, waving a dismissive hand. "But it's just loud. Filipinos are great at being loud and theatrical, but you don't have the stillness for the American screen. You can't carry a movie because your culture doesn't value the kind of internal nuance we need here. It's a biological mismatch for the medium." The words hit Mateo like a physical blow to the chest, more painful than any rejection he had ever faced. It wasn't just a critique of his acting. It was a condemnation of his entire identity and the heritage of millions of artists back home. That night, Mateo sat on the floor of his cramped studio apartment in Koreatown, the director's words looping in his head like a broken record. Biological mismatch. The cruelty of the phrase sparked a fire in him that replaced his despair. He realized that if he stayed in the traditional system, he would always be at the mercy of men like Vane, who saw him as a caricature rather than a human being. He decided then that he wouldn't beg for a seat at their table anymore. He would build his own. He reached out to an independent Filipino-American filmmaker, Elena Cruz, who was struggling to fund a gritty, low-budget psychological thriller called The Blackballing. The script was haunting, centering on an undocumented man who witnesses a crime and must navigate a psychological labyrinth of fear and invisibility. It was a stillness Vane claimed he lacked, and Mateo knew it was his only path to redemption. Production on The Blackballing was a testament to the power of spite and passion. They had no trailers, no fancy catering, and no big studio backing. They filmed in the shadows of the city, using the natural grit of the streets to tell a story that Hollywood ignored. Mateo took Vane's insult about lack of nuance and turned into a performance of extreme minimalism. He communicated volumes through the slight twitch of muscle in his jaw, or the way his eyes glazed over when his character felt cornered. He stayed in character for 16 hours a day, living on the same meager wages as a protagonist, losing weight until his cheekbones looked like razors. Elena watched through the monitor, realized they were capturing something transcendent, something that defied every stereotype the industry had ever projected onto their people. As the film entered the editing phase, word began to leak out about a powerhouse performance in a tiny indie flick. A prominent film critic saw a rough cut at a small festival and wrote a column titled, "The Actor Who Proved the Giants Wrong." The buzz grew into a roar, and suddenly, The Blackballing was picked up by a major independent distributor. While Julian Vane's big-budget epic was floundering in post-production with reports of wooden acting and soulless storytelling, Mateo's film was becoming a cultural phenomenon. It wasn't just the Filipino community showing up. It was everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. The internal complexity that Vane said Mateo didn't possess was now being hailed by the New York Times as the most sophisticated acting scene in a generation. The award season arrived like a whirlwind. Mateo found himself on the same red carpets as the icons he had once admired from afar. At the Golden Globes, he ended up standing just a few feet away from Julian Vane. The director looked older, more haggard, his latest film having been a critical and commercial disaster. Vane tried to offer a polite, condescending nod, but Mateo simply looked through him. He didn't need Vane's validation anymore. He had the validation of the work itself. When Mateo won the Globe for Best Actor, his speech was short and pointed. This is for the people who were told their stillness was absence and their passion was too much. We are here, and we have always been capable. The camera panned to Vane, who looked like he wanted to vanish into floorboards. The road to the Oscars was paved with both adulation and intense scrutiny. The director versus actor narrative became the headline of every trade magazine. Critics dug up Vane's old comments, pitting them against Mateo's undeniable brilliance. It became a proxy war for the soul of Hollywood, between the old guard who believed in rigid, racialized hierarchies of talent and a new wave that demanded meritocracy. Mateo remained humble, focusing on his craft and his community. He flew back to Manila for a week, visiting the small theaters where he started, telling young actors that the only person who can truly limit your talent is yourself. He was no longer just an actor. He was a symbol of a nation's artistic awakening on the world stage. Oscar night was a fever dream. The Dolby Theater was packed with the most powerful people in entertainment, and the air was electric with anticipation. When the category for Best Actor was finally announced, the presenters were two legends of the screen who spoke about the transformative power of empathy. As the clips played, Mateo's face filled the giant screen, a moment of pure, silent agony from The Blackballing that made the entire audience hold its breath. It was a stillness that Vane had mocked, now magnified to the size of a skyscraper. The silence in the room during his clip was the loudest answer to the director's prejudice. When the envelope was opened, the name called wasn't the A-list veteran or the British theater legend. It was Mateo Santos. The walk to the stage felt like it lasted a lifetime. As Mateo stood at the podium, clutching the heavy gold statue. He looked out at a sea of standing ovations. In the third row, Julian Vane sat motionless, forced to clap a man he had called a biological mismatch. Mateo didn't mention Vane by name. He didn't have to. I was told once that my people didn't have the internal life of the screen, Mateo said, his voice steady and resonant. But tonight, we prove that the human heart speaks every language, and it beats in every chest. This isn't just my Oscar. This belongs to every Filipino artist who was told to stay in the background. Your light is too bright to be dimmed by anyone's narrow vision. The aftermath of the win was a seismic shift in industry. Production companies began greenlighting stories centered on Southeast Asian narratives, no longer seeing them as niche or limited. Mateo became the most sought-after actor in the world, but he used his power to ensure that he wasn't the only one through the door. He started a production company dedicated to finding talent in the provinces of the Philippines, bridging the gap between Manila and Hollywood. The Vane incident, as it came to be known, became a cautionary tale for directors who mistook their own biases for objective truth. The narrative had been permanently rewritten, not by a PR campaign, but by the sheer, undeniable force of talent that refused to be ignored. In the years that followed, Mateo continued to challenge himself, taking roles that spanned genres and continents. He played a Shakespearean king, a futuristic rebel, and a quiet father in a suburban drama. Each time, he brought that same nuance that had once been denied to him. He remained a man of the people, often seen in the local markets of Manila when he wasn't filming, reminding everyone that he was still the same boy who dreamed under the neon lights. The Oscar sat on his mantelpiece, not as a trophy of ego, but as a lighthouse for others. It served as a reminder that when someone tells you that you can't do something because of who you are, it usually means they are afraid of what you will become. Julian Vane's career never recovered. He became a relic of a bygone era, his films increasingly out of touch with a globalized world that craved authenticity over artifice. In a final interview before his retirement, he was asked about Mateo Santos. He paused for a long time, looking at a poster of the ballot ban on the wall of the journalist's office. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice a mere whisper. I looked at him and saw a category. He looked at the world and saw humanity. He didn't just act, he lived. And in doing so, he made me realize how little I actually knew about the craft I claimed to master. It was a final victory for Mateo, not just winning the award, but changing the mind of his greatest detractor. The story of Mateo Santos is more than just a zero-to-hero tale. It is a blueprint for cultural resistance. It highlights the invisible barriers that many artists from the global South face when trying to enter the Western canon. By focusing on his specific frictional journey, we see the microaggressions and systemic dismissals that usually go unrecorded. Mateo didn't just want to be famous. He wanted to be seen as a peer. His journey from the audition room of Julian Vane to the stage of the Oscars is a reminder that excellence is the best revenge. It challenges every viewer to look past their own preconceived notions and recognize the depth of the person standing in front of them. As we conclude this documentary-style look at his life, we see Mateo on the set of his latest film, directing a young Filipina actress. He speaks to her with a kindness he was never shown, encouraging her to find the stillness within her own experience. The cycle of prejudice has been broken, replaced by a cycle of mentorship and empowerment. The Hollywood director said Filipinos can't act, but the world now knows differently. They don't just act. They breathe life into shadows. They find the music in the silence, and they carry the weight of their stories with a grace that can move mountains. Mateo Santos didn't just win an Oscar. He won a future for an entire generation of dreamers. The impact of Mateo's one resonated far beyond the walls of the Dolby Theater, sparking a massive resurgence in the Filipino film industry, often referred to as the Third Golden Age. Investors who previously saw Filipino cinema as a domestic-only market began pouring capital into high-quality productions intended for global release. This shift wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. For too long, the Filipino role in global media was defined by others, but now, the storytellers were taking the reins. Mateo's production company, Kayumanggi Films, became a hub for this movement, focusing on scripts that explored the complex intersection of tradition and modernity, proving that local stories have universal appeal. In the streets of Manila, Mateo was treated like a returning king, but he resisted the trappings of celebrity. He organized free acting workshops in public parks, teaching the same techniques he used to baffle Julian Vane. He told his students that the camera is a lie detector, and the only way to beat a bias system is to be so truthful that they cannot look away. He focused on internal life, teaching them how to process their historical trauma and cultural joy into their performances. These workshops produced a new wave of actors who didn't wait for Hollywood's permission. They created content that the world eventually had to come looking for. Back in Hollywood, the Mateo Effect forced studios to audit their casting processes. The old colorblind casting, which often resulted in the same types of faces, was replaced by proactive inclusion. Agents started scouted theater festivals in Southeast Asia with the same fervor they usually reserve for London or New York. The narrative that certain ethnicities were better at certain genres began to dissolve. Mateo had opened a door that could never be closed again, and through it walked writers, directors, and cinematographers who brought a fresh, vibrant perspective to the screen. The industry was finally beginning to look like the world it represented. Despite his success, Mateo faced a new set of challenges, the pressure of being a representative. Every move he made was scrutinized by both the Filipino public and the international press. He was expected to be perfect, a burden he found heavier than the Oscar itself. He spoke openly about this in an intimate interview, explaining that to be the first is a gift, but to be the only one is a prison. He worked tirelessly to ensure he wasn't a token win, pushing for more Filipino representation in the Academy itself. He wanted a world where a Filipino winning an Oscar wasn't a shocker or a miracle, but a regular occurrence based on talent. One of the most poignant moments of his post-Oscar career was his return to the stage. He chose a small, experimental play in a 100-seat theater in Los Angeles, playing a man losing his memory. There were no cameras, no special effects, just the stillness he had perfected. Tickets sold out in seconds, with critics from all over the world flying in to see the man who had humbled Julian Vane. The performance was described as monastic and shattering. It proved that Mateo wasn't a product of a lucky script or a clever director, but a master of his craft who could command an audience with nothing but his presence. As the years passed, the legend of the director who said they can't act became a foundational story for film students. It was taught in ethics classes as a lesson on the dangers of aesthetic bias. Meanwhile, Mateo's filmography grew to include some of the most respected works of the 21st century. He collaborated with visionary directors from South Korea, Mexico, and France, becoming a truly global citizen of cinema. He never forgot his roots, however, often incorporating Tagalog phrases into his scripts or ensuring that his characters had backstories that honored his heritage. He was a bridge between two worlds, standing firm on both shores. The frictional nature of his story, the direct conflict between a powerful oppressor and a resilient artist, served as the perfect script for his own life. It was a drama with a clear villain and a triumphant hero, but Mateo always insisted the story was larger than him. He often said in interviews that the director wasn't just one man, but a set of ideas that had existed for 100 years. By defeating those ideas, he hadn't just saved his own career. He had liberated the imaginations of thousands of others who had been conditioned to believe they were less than in the eyes of the West. During a retrospective of his work at the Cannes Film Festival, Mateo was asked what he would say to a young version of himself, the boy crying on the floor of the Koreatown apartment. He smiled, a look of profound peace on his face. "I would tell him to keep crying," he said, "because those tears are the ink for your future. I would tell him that the man who says you can't act is actually giving you a map of what you need to master. Don't run from the insult. Use it as a mirror to see your own strength. You aren't a mismatch. You're the missing piece the world didn't know it needed." The documentary footage of his life shows a man who remained remarkably grounded. We see him cooking adobo for his crew on a high-budget sci-fi set, or laughing with his mother on a video call before a major premiere. This humanity was his greatest weapon. While Julian Vane sought gravitas through distance and ego, Mateo found it through connection and vulnerability. He proved that the American screen didn't need a specific biological type. It needed truth. And truth, as Mateo demonstrated, is the most powerful currency in any culture, regardless of where it originates. In a surprising turn of events, Julian Vane's estate reached out to Mateo years later, offering him the rights to Vane's unpublished memoirs. Mateo declined to use them for a biopic, but he did read the chapter about their audition. In it, Vane had written, "I saw the sun in that room, and I was so used to the dark that I called it a glare." It was a final, posthumous admission of the director's own limitations. Mateo kept the manuscript in his library, a reminder that even the most closed minds can eventually find a crack of light, even if it takes a lifetime to admit it. The legacy of Mateo Santos is cemented not just in the history books, but in the very fabric of modern storytelling. Today, when we see a Filipino actor lead a romantic comedy, a horror film, or a superhero franchise, we are seeing the ripples of that one Oscar night. The barriers of cultural legibility have been replaced by a celebration of cultural specificity. We no longer ask if a Filipino can act. We ask what incredible performance they will give us next. The biological mismatch theory has been tossed into the dustbin of history, alongside other relics of a less enlightened time. As we watch the final clips of Mateo's career, we see a man who has aged with the same grace he brought to his roles. His hair is silver, but his eyes still hold that same fire he had in Quezon City. He has become an elder statesman of the arts, a man whose presence in a film guarantees a level of soul that is rare in any era. He continues to advocate for the underdog, reminding the industry that the next Mateo Santos is likely sitting in a waiting room somewhere right now, being told no by someone who thinks they know better. The story of the Hollywood director and the Filipino actor is a modern myth, a tale of David and Goliath played out on the silver screen. It teaches us that the loudest voices are not always the most truthful, and that the most powerful art often comes from the places we are told to ignore. Mateo's journey is a testament to the fact that talent is a universal language, but it requires courage to speak it in a room full of people who refuse to listen. He spoke it. He shouted it, and eventually he made the whole world sing along. In his final public appearance at the Academy Awards as a presenter for Best Picture, Mateo looked out at a diverse audience that reflected the true richness of humanity. He didn't need to give a long speech this time. He simply stood there, a living embodiment of the progress that had been made. The applause lasted for 5 minutes, a standing ovation for a man who had changed the industry by simply being himself. He smiled, tapped his heart, and whispered a quiet salamat into the microphone, a word that echoed in the homes of millions across the globe. So, the next time you hear someone say that a certain group of people can't do something, or that they lack the internal life for greatness, remember Mateo Santos. Remember the director who thought he was a god, and the actor who proved he was only a man. The gold of an Oscar may fade, but the courage to stand up against prejudice and prove your worth through your work is a legacy that lasts forever. The credits roll on this story, but for the Filipino actors following his footsteps, the real movie is just beginning. What once was a closed door is now a wide-open horizon, waiting for the next great performance to light up the dark. This is History Media. Like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.